Good morning. It is awesome to see such a tremendous crowd here this service. So if you've got a Bible or an electronic device on you, go ahead and open up with me to Genesis chapter 29. That's where we're going to be this morning. If you don't, and here in the lower sections, there should be a Bible around you. Or in the upper sections, you can grab one at one of the tables at the entrances. We're going to be on page 19 in those Bibles. Well, this morning, we are kicking off a brand new series that I am so excited about. It is a series all about marriage that we are calling Before and After. We value marriage a lot around here at CCJ, and we realize that for most people, marriage is one of the biggest issues in their life and in their faith. In fact, I often think of a conversation I had when I was ministering in Phoenix, sitting at a Starbucks across from a guy I greatly respected in my church who admitted, with tears in his eyes, that his marriage was the most difficult struggle in his life. And I think there's a lot of us who could probably relate to that. As a culture, together, we really haven't figured out marriage very well. In fact, we all know the statistics that about 50% of those people that get married, those marriages end in divorce. What those statistics don't tell us is that there's even a larger percentage of people that are just giving up on marriage altogether. In fact, for the very first time in American history, there are more single households than there are married households. Marriage is in decline. In fact, a quick glance around our culture quickly shows us that most of the people in our culture haven't figured out marriage, continue to be baffled by it, and view it as something that's pretty complicated. In fact, interestingly enough, the New Testament talks about how difficult it is. The Apostle Paul in Ephesians chapter 5 said, hey, a man should leave his father and mother and be joined with his wife. The two shall become united, become one. And then he goes on to say, and this is a mystery. A lot of you would probably like to amen that statement, but I wouldn't suggest it, okay? Unless you want a nice swift elbow to the ribs, okay? Yeah, it's complicated, and we know it. It's a mystery. And so what we want to do over this 4-week period is begin to provide some clarity to this difficult, perplexing relationship in our lives. And we're going to do it in kind of a unique fashion where we're going to look at marriage from a lot of different life phases, our perspective and our understanding of marriage from these life phases. From singleness, before you say I do, from being married after you say I do, from a marriage on the rocks, before you say it's over, to living in light of divorce after you say it's over. And we hope that in doing this and going through these 4 weeks, every single person in our church will be hit with the truth of the gospel in their life when it comes to marriage, that we would begin to provide some clarity to all of this. And as we start with that first one this morning, before you say I do, I want to start the sermon in kind of a unique way. I need some crowd participation. You think you guys could do that for me? Yeah? Okay. Ladies, I'm going to start with you. Okay, I'm going to ask you to be honest. How many of you, when you were a young girl, you dreamed of your perfect wedding, your perfect marriage? You had visions of your Prince Charming and how awesome your life was going to be together. Maybe even by age 16, you had named your unborn kids. How many women in the room could say that? Yeah, quite a few. Okay, that's what I thought. Fellas, how about you? Okay. How many of you, starting in maybe time you were a teenager, dreamed of getting married and being intimate with your wife twice a day and 3 times on Sunday? Yeah, I don't know actually if I would raise my hands if I was you. For everybody in the room, how many of you are still dreaming? Yeah. Absolutely. Hey, we all have some unrealistic expectations. We all have a lot of hopes and expectations when we get married. And we find out that a lot of times, in fact, most of those aren't going to come to fruition, and in fact actually lead us down a path of some problems in our lives. We actually head in a direction in our marriage that is going to complicate things. And so for you singles in the room, whether you are single or you're dating someone or you're engaged, we want to talk about those expectations this morning when it comes to you getting married. Now, for you married people in the room, don't tune me out. I actually think that you're going to learn some new truth this morning as well, and some foundational things that we're going to build on over the next couple of weeks in this series. And what I want us all to understand, this foundation that I want us to get, is pretty simple this morning. In fact, I want you to walk away with one basic principle today. I'm not going to complicate it. I just want you to walk away understanding this one thing, and I can be honest in saying that most of you aren't going to like it when you hear it at first. But I want you to hear me out when I say this, and it's this. This is the principle. That success in marriage isn't primarily about who you marry, but about why you marry. Let me say that again. That success in marriage isn't primarily about who you marry, it is about why you marry. Now, don't misunderstand me. The who matters. Who we matter is very important. It's just not of first importance. In fact, without the foundation of why we are getting married, we are leading ourselves down a path of a lot of difficulty. And the problem is our culture actually has these flipped upside down. We look at marriage the other way around. In fact, I can guarantee you there's a lot of people in the room who went about the courtship process in about the same way. They were dating someone and they began to fall head over heels in love with them. They started to get infatuated with one another. They started to feel all these emotions and feelings they had never felt before in their lives. The chemistry was through the roof, and they honestly couldn't keep their hands off each other. And in some situations, let's just be real, they were sleeping together. And then by our worldly standards, they would say, hey, yeah, I've never felt a connection like I was feeling with this person. And they never think about the why. Never even enters their mind. In fact, the only why that they think of is, man, I'm feeling so great. This feels awesome. My needs are getting met. I just want to feel this way forever. That's the reason I'm getting married. And common sense would tell us that we're not going to feel that way forever. In fact, we've seen a lot of other people fall in and out of love. We've fallen in and out of love of a lot of things ourselves. But love is so intoxicating that honestly, it kind of renders us stupid. And so we begin to think things that are even a little irrational. I've heard couples say this, maybe you have as well, things like, well, we're special. You know, like, we love each other like no one in the history of mankind has ever loved each other. And you chuckle because you know it's true. It was you. You thought those thoughts when you were dating. So many of us did. And you had all these thoughts, I'm different, I'm special. We don't think about the why. And here's what happens. You end up getting married, and 18 months in, or 7 years down the road, or after 12 years, when the feelings begin to fade a little bit, and the chemistry fizzles, and life hits you with all these complicated situations and scenarios, for the very first time, couples start asking themselves the why of marriage at that point. That's the first time, and they end up calling the church, or they seek out counseling, which isn't a bad thing, by the way. It's a good thing, but they seek out counseling, or they're trying to get their friends to help them out. Why am I married? They're trying to have other people help them out. Why am I married? And here's what I want you to understand. If you are single in the room this morning, it would probably be a good idea now to start to figure out the why of marriage now and not wait till later. Now, please understand me, this is not a legalistic sermon. I'm not saying that we don't worship a grace-filled, loving God who can't turn around even the messiest of situations. He can. But I've seen way more of these types of marriages falter or fail than I've seen stay together. And so again, if you are single in the room, you better start asking yourself the why question now. Now, interestingly enough, this isn't a new problem. I think it's a bigger problem than it's ever been before, but it's not a new problem. In fact, it goes back thousands of years to the very first book of the Bible, to Genesis, where I had you open up to earlier. In fact, we're going to read a really interesting story that has a lot of twists that we don't really have all that much time to get into, involving I think three people who get involved in this weird scenario of sorts. In fact, it all revolves around this historical, biblical Old Testament character named Jacob. Jacob sees this young, attractive girl named Rachel, and he thinks to himself like, oh my goodness, I have got to have this girl. And then her sister gets involved, and they all three have this weird love triangle going on, trying to figure things out, all because they didn't understand this principle we're talking about this morning. Now, to give you some context as to what we're going to be diving into, this character, Jacob, he's away from home, he walks up to this well, and he meets his Uncle Laban's daughter named Rachel. She's incredibly gorgeous. And likely because of this, at first sight, at first meeting, he falls in love with her. He's convinced she is the one who's going to make his story a happily ever after. Now, if you're doing the math in your head, you've probably caught on already. This is his Uncle Laban's daughter making Rachel his cousin. Yes, this is like a scene from Alaskan Bush People, okay? This was the first reality show that ever existed. It's a little weird. And I don't know this for sure, but I think I'm maybe reading into the story a little bit here, but I think Jacob was convinced that Rachel was the answer to the voids that he was filling in his life. Again, I think he was convinced she was going to be the one that was going to make life great and make his story a happily ever after. In fact, if we were able to go back and show you the previous couple of chapters before this, I think you'd begin to see that Jacob's at a crossroads in his life at this period in his life. At this point, he's never really had the love of his father, and we know how much that impacts our lives. He's recently lost the love of his mother. He has a brother who's trying to kill him for some things that he's done. And then, if all that's not enough, we know that at this point in his life, he didn't understand the unconditional love of his heavenly Father. So it's no surprise that when Jacob stumbles upon this beautiful girl, he thinks to himself, if I could just get married, my life would make sense. She will feel the emptiness that is going on inside of me. She will fulfill me. And he begins to put in place a plan to make this happen. We actually see this starting in the middle of verse 14 there in chapter 29. It says this: after Jacob had stayed with Laban for about a month, Laban said to him, you shouldn't work for me without pay, just because we are relatives. Tell me how much your wages should be. Now Laban had 2 daughters. The older daughter was named Leah. The younger one was named Rachel. There was no sparkle in Leah's eye. Now, that's kind of a nice way of saying that her external looks were not very good, okay? This is like if you've ever heard someone say, he or she is big-boned, okay? That's kind of what the Bible's saying. We know later on she's a beautiful woman inside, but compared to her sister physically on the external, it doesn't compare. In fact, it goes on to say, but Rachel had a beautiful figure and a lovely face. Since Jacob was in love with Rachel, he told her father, I will work for 7 years if you'll give me Rachel, your younger daughter, as my wife. Now, it's pretty interesting here. Jacob's only known Rachel for about a month. And in that culture, they really wouldn't have been able to interact very much, according to the customs and practices. And so, based on very limited information, Jacob is convinced that she is the person he needs to marry. Obviously, all externally based, and we could probably preach a whole nother sermon just on that. But regardless, he looks at her and says, this is the who. This is the person who's going to complete me. This is the person that's, I love the way I'm feeling. I want to feel this way forever. We could say maybe he's infatuated with his own infatuation. And so he makes this deal to work for her. Now, it's a foreign concept to us, but in that culture, they had like a dowry-like system in place. And so he agrees to terms with his uncle, Laban, that he's going to work for 7 years for her hand in marriage. Now, I can tell you, I've heard a lot of sermons on this text. I've read a lot of blog posts. I've heard a lot of people talk who think this is just the most romantic thing, okay? Oh, he's going to work for 7 years for her? That is so cute. You know, in fact, we read in verse 20, it goes on to say that it only felt like a few days for him. I mean, it's a line right out of Princess Bride. We can all be like, oh, that is so adorable, isn't it? No, it's not, actually. In fact, we're going to find out that this is a mess that's going on here. For starters, what we're going on here is that Jacob literally offers Laban services over 3 times what was the normal practice in that day. In fact, if you read verse 18 in the Hebrew, what it comes across as a very desperate man trying to make a deal. It's like, I'll do anything for her. 3, 4, okay, 7 years, I'll do it. Just give me her hand in marriage. I mean, that's how it reads. Jacob has lost his mind. He is so Rachel focused. He is so convinced that she is going to complete him and fill him that he's compromising all sorts of things for love and treating her as if she is going to be his savior. And if that's not enough, we read in verse 24 his true heart, 21 his true heart. It says, finally the time came for him to marry her. I just imagine this knock at the door from Jacob, and he says, I have fulfilled my agreement, Jacob said to Laban. Now give me my wife so that I can sleep with her. Well, that's not very romantic. I can tell you from experience, that doesn't work out so well. Now, this translation is really weak, but actually, if you were to read it in Hebrew, this comes across as really offensive, okay, what he says to Laban. He's literally treating this like a transaction. He wants Rachel to meet his needs, fill his voids, and make him happy. In fact, this is a microcosm of the whole story, actually, of what's going on here. And I want you to take notice. That we never read anything. There's never mentioned any prayer. There's never any mention of God. There's never any mention of spiritual connection and or direction. This is simply a man pursuing marriage for wanting to get his needs met, his voids filled by someone he's insanely attracted to. Sound familiar? Yeah, we all have a little bit of Jacob in us. So oftentimes we pursue love and relationships and marriage through the exact same lens. And sadly, we live in this culture that packages it with such romantic ideals that most of the time we don't even realize that we're doing it. In fact, I think there's a couple of pretty hurtful myths in our lives that lead us down the exact same path that Jacob was on. In fact, the first myth is this one. I think it's the "you complete me" myth. I call this oftentimes the Jerry Maguire syndrome. If you've watched that movie, you know what I mean. Jerry Maguire says, "You complete me." Dorothy, what's her line back? Just stop it. You had me at hello, and all the girls cry. It's this great moment. We love that stuff. Like Jacob, we've convinced ourselves that if we find the right person, that they will meet all of our needs, fill in all of our weaknesses, and they will complete us. Every movie we watch, every TV show that we see, every song we listen to on the radio, every book that we read only propels this theory forward in our lives. But there's some pretty troubling problems that come along with this theory that most of us never address. And the first one, I think actually I shouldn't say the first, the biggest one, I think this is the thing that we've got to get a hold of, is that I think it diminishes our true identity and devalues singleness. Church, the New Testament tells us we have already been made complete through Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection if we've given our lives to him. The New Testament describes us as being made complete, being made alive, being God's masterpiece. We've already been completed. We don't need marriage to do that. So if we choose to get married, which is a great thing, it's this blessing from God that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But if we choose to get married or not, both ways, we're complete. And I think this is important for some of us in the room that have been divorced, or maybe we've lost a spouse and we're widowed now. Our life is not somehow over. We are still complete even in our singleness. We are valuable because of what Jesus has done for us, not because of a worldly relationship. In fact, Paul talks in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 about the fact that there's actually even a gift to singleness. He says, I want you to be free from the concerns of this life. An unmarried man can spend his time doing the Lord's work and thinking how to please him, but a married man has to think about his earthly responsibilities and how to please his wife. His interests are divided. And he actually goes on to flip this around to talk about married women as well. You see, "you complete me" is devaluing what God has done in our lives and what God is wanting to do in our lives. And if you are single in this room, and if you are single and you've not found your identity in that, if you've never rested your life in the gospel message, I can promise you are going to continue to be discontent, and you're going to walk into your marriage expecting your spouse to be your savior. It's a myth. It's not the only myth, though. There's another myth that we have in our culture, and I think it's very similar to the first one, but we walk it out in a different way. It's the myth of the one. Man, we love this. Every wedding we go, we hear vows, we hear it. Every movie, social media post about our marriages. Man, they're even on the Christian Mingle commercials. I mean, I hate it, but it's on the Christian Mingle commercials. We love it. In fact, sociologists have discovered that we are more obsessed with the one than any culture or generation before us. In fact, 94% of women cite it as a requirement for their spouse, that he has to be their soulmate. But can I tell you something? It's really bad biblical theology. Really bad. In fact, I promise you, you can read the Bible from cover to cover and you won't find anything about it. It doesn't exist. In fact, the one actually comes from Greek mythology and philosophy. Plato, in fact. Kind of a little bit of a weird story. He surmised that there was once a super race of humans that attempted to overthrow the gods. And so Zeus, seeing all of this going on, decided they were getting too powerful, and he wanted to cut each of them into two, creating two separate beings that were both weaker. Plato then decided that this forceful cutting in two left both halves so desperate to be reunited with the other half. that they constantly were seeking after him. And that when we found our other half, that was the person that had made everything else in the world seem incomplete in comparison to them. And in that moment, we knew we'd found the one, or we'd found our soulmate. So we can blame Zeus and Plato for this whole idea. It's bad biblical theology. It doesn't exist. But even worse, and this is what I want you to understand, it's really bad life theology. In fact, I get to see this all the time in being a minister in my line of work. But it's so sad to watch the fact that we get so obsessed with the one that it creates so much of a focus on who we're marrying that we spend all of our time obsessing over this mythical pursuit of who's meant to be. And it creates this laziness, like I shouldn't have to work hard in love. I shouldn't have to have any dedication in my marriage. It should just be easy. It should just come natural. In fact, I can't tell you how many people I've heard in the middle of in a bad marriage or in a divorce or in a breakup say things like, well, love's just not supposed to be that difficult. It's just not supposed to be that hard. And I always want to say, oh, really? Who are you hanging out with? And what planet are you living on? Because I'd like to meet these people. Man, we are all difficult to love, myself included. And the problem is when we begin to believe this myth and we begin to walk it out, man, there's all kinds of destructive things that begin to happen. For some of us in our dating, we've literally changed our dating practices to chase after the one. We've decided things like cohabitation and living together are a great idea. And I get it, honestly. If I believe in the one, it's a natural extension of that. I mean, if I'm after one person, if it's about who I marry, if I've got to find one person on the entire globe, then I need to make sure I try out a few models, like testing out a few cars to make sure I've got the right one. We've got the right compatibility. You know, interestingly enough, though, it's not necessarily just about who we marry. And in fact, the statistics are showing this doesn't work for us. In fact, the divorce rate is much higher among those who cohabitate before they get married than those that don't. Well, that's not working for us. Another way we walk this out is actually later on in our marriage. If we believe in the one, at some point it's going to rear its ugly head in our marriage. And I see this happen all the time. Because what happens when I'm married and then decide that someone else might be the one? I mean, imagine a guy, for instance, who's 15 years into a marriage. And the chemistry is not really what it needs to be, that him and his wife really don't have sex anymore. They've had 3 kids. Her figure doesn't look like it did when they first got married. They've got all this chaos and busyness going on. And suddenly he meets someone else, whether at work or at the gym or surfing Facebook. And he begins to think to himself, did I marry the right person? Is this who I'm meant to be with? And what do you know? We end up hearing about a divorce, or we end up hearing about an affair. We could flip the script and look at it from a woman's perspective. A wife that's in a marriage that's kind of in a lull, it's kind of in a mediocre phase. They're not communicating the way that they need to be. And this guy comes into her life and he listens to her and he affirms her and he makes her feel valuable. And she begins to ask herself the question, am I with the right person? Is this who I'm supposed to be married with? It's so much easier with him. And we end up hearing about a divorce, or we end up hearing about an affair. You know, ironically though, that while there's a lot of people that try to defend this position, you just need to go after who you think you need to go with. You know, the divorce rate astronomically jumps up with each marriage. Astronomically. It's crazy. That's not working for us. These are myths. Church, the one is bad life theology. And here's the point that I'm trying to get across this morning. In so many ways, we are Jacob. Just as he did thousands of years ago, we allow our culture to convince us of these myths, and we pursue dating and marriage strictly on the basis of finding someone who's going to fill our needs, fill our voids, and make us happy. But I got to tell you something this morning. It can't be done. It can't be done. I've hinted at this a lot this morning, but when we enter marriage that way, being completely who-oriented, we will always end up getting disappointed. In fact, this happens to Jacob. Look down with me at verse 22. It says, so, it's wedding time, by the way. He says, so Laban invited everyone in the neighborhood and prepared a wedding feast. But that night, when it was dark, Laban took Leah, not Rachel, Leah to Jacob, and he slept with her. But when Jacob woke in the morning, it was Leah. What have you done to me, Jacob raged to Laban. I worked for 7 years for Rachel. Why have you tricked me? No, there's big wedding feast celebration gets thrown. And my guess is that Jacob has more to drink than he should have. I mean, again, he doesn't know God very well at this point in his life. He's worked 7 years for this woman. It's time for him to celebrate. And at this, Laban takes advantage of the situation. He's not a very good guy. Now, in his one defense, Leah should have been married off first in that culture. The oldest daughter was always supposed to be married off. It didn't happen. And I think he looks and says Leah's prospects aren't very good. So he dresses her up like Rachel, puts this big veil over her face, and sends her in to sleep with Jacob. And in the morning, it's kind of like a scene out of a movie we watched. Jacob rolls over and screams. It's like, ah! Like, that's not Rachel, that's Leah. What is going on here? Didn't turn out the way that he thought it would. He's greatly disappointed, and in fact, he's going to work 7 more years for Rachel. Now, the question always gets asked, why in the world would Leah do this to herself? I mean, why does she agree to this whole thing? And I think the more we read on this story, we begin to understand that Leah was doing to Jacob the exact thing Jacob was doing to Rachel. I think she was convinced that if he slept with her, that if he really got to know her, he would love her instead. That he would fulfill her. She has obviously some major voids that we find out in her life, really this deep desire to be loved, and I think she thought, well, maybe this will be the answer to it. And sadly, for all the parties involved, they end up as this big disappointment. It never turns out the way that they hope it will. And in fact, we will see fallout for generations to come because of some of the decision-making they have happened. And singles, here's what you need to understand. You will be disappointed too if you pursue love and marriage in the same way. In fact, you need to know. You will go to bed with the Rachels of your life and wake up with a Leah. I'm serious. You will go to bed with the Rachels in your life and wake up with a Leah, because they cannot be who you need them to be and want them to be. They are not that now. In fact, I love the way that the Duke University ethics professor, Stanley Hurris, says about this. And it's going to step on some toes, but listen to this. He says, destructive to marriage is the self-fulfillment ethic that assumes marriage and the family are primarily institutions of personal fulfillment, necessary for us to become whole or happy. The assumption is that there is someone just right for us to marry, and that if we look closely enough, we will find the right person. The moral assumption overlooks a crucial aspect to marriage. It fails to appreciate the fact that we always marry the wrong person. We never know whom we marry, we just think that we do. Or even if we marry at first the right person, just give it a little while and he or she will change. For marriage, being the enormous thing that it is, means that we are not the same person after we have entered it. The primary challenge of marriage is learning how to love and care for the stranger to whom you find yourself married. Man, those are tough words. But do you hear what he's saying? It's not primarily about who we marry, it's about why we marry. And this brings us right to the why. This is what I want us to understand. Some of you are like, okay, you've told us enough about the who. What is the why now? And here it is. That I think the why of marriage, that I get married because I believe marriage is a God-designed relationship to help me become more like him and to help others become more like him. Now, I know that's a really unromantic definition for some of you. And please understand, I still believe wholeheartedly in romance and love and chemistry. Those are great things I think God has designed for spouses to connect. But that's not all marriage is. In fact, the more I read the New Testament, the more I read Scripture, the more I see that God has not primarily designed marriage just for us to be happy, but to make us holy. See, the fact of the matter is, God has filled our need to be loved through Jesus Christ. He's filled our voids already. And so at that, the marriage has to be about something else than those things. And I think that it's the fact that God wants us to become more like him. He wants others to become more like him. It is a transforming relationship for so many. And when we understand this and we walk into dating and marriage with this in our mindset, we have the proper expectations. In fact, let me help you understand a little bit better from my own life, from my own marriage. I can tell you honestly speaking in my marriage that marriage has been the most sin-exposing, idol-shattering, humble-inducing, mission-calling experience of my life. Hands down. In fact, when I first met Bree, I was a really pride-filled young guy. I'd gotten all these accolades in college. I'd had all these people tell me how great I was going to be and all the great things I was going to do, and I believed them. And I quickly found out something, that you can fake it on stage, you can fake it in the church lobby, but you can't fake it in a marriage. Yeah, Bree got to see the real me. My sin got exposed, and I had to deal with it. In fact, I remember some of our early arguments, some of our early fights being a great example of this. Bree has got this sweet, delicate personality. She doesn't like to argue. She doesn't like to fight. She's not very good at it. I, on the other hand, was like a professional at it, and that's not a compliment to me. I could pridefully defend my position and have us talking in circles for hours. And very quickly, I remember some of those early debates and some of those early arguments, watching her tear up and her eyes well up when I would say something hurtful. And it did something to me where I looked and I was like, man, like, I'm sinful. This is a mess. I'm not who I need to be in my life. I don't want to see that look coming at me. And so I had to begin to address some things going on in my life that I needed to get better at. And that all happened because of marriage. Or I could look at the fact that I've not been very good at loving Bree the way that she deserves to be loved. I think we can all agree that Bree is way out of my league. In fact, if you've ever seen us stand next to each other or heard us talk for more than 5 minutes, you know I way out-kicked my coverage, okay? I'm the reacher, she's the settler. I'm okay with that, but here's the deal. Bree isn't perfect. In fact, she is a sinner in need of grace, just like the rest of us. She can't meet all of my needs. She makes poor choices, she makes mistakes, and it's in those moments, it's been exposed in my life that I'm not always really great at loving her, forgiving, showing grace like I should be. In fact, when I read 1 Corinthians chapter 13, it describes love as patient, as kind, not jealous, not boastful, not proud, not rude, not demanding, not irritable, not harboring the past, that it never gives up, that it never loses faith, it's always hopeful, and endures through every circumstance. And if I'm being real, I'm awful at most every single one of those things on the list. In fact, I can't tell you how many times I've prayed to God, God, I see it now because of my marriage. I want to love like you love, like you have loved me, because I am so far off from it. And that's all happened because of marriage. And I could go on and on and on and talk about how marriage has changed my priority, how it's instilled character, how it's softened my heart, how it's helped me change other people's lives, how it's made me more missional in my community and with my neighbors. I could go on and on and on. But the point is this, that has happened in my life because I understood the why of marriage. I didn't go into marriage expecting that my life was going to be a Nicholas Sparks movie played out in real life. Even though Bree and I we have a lot of fun and we have romance, what marriage really is about is both of us hearing, well done, good and faithful servant, at the end of our lives when we stand in front of our Maker. And if you are single or if you are engaged or you are dating someone in this room, you having the same perspective will dictate your success in your singleness and your marriage. Romans 3:23 doesn't stop applying when you get married. We have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Sin will make its way into your marriage. You will not be able to meet each other's needs. You will fall short of each other's standards. In fact, I get irritated that the fact that the church doesn't talk more about this. We want to spend so much time talking about surface level stuff, how to date better, how to fight better, how to meet his needs, how to meet her needs. You can't do it. Not totally. And it's in those moments when you fall short of each other's expectations, you have two choices to make. You can be in a who-centered marriage, where you point fingers at each other and say, you're not meeting my needs, you're not being the person that I need you to be. And you can fight and you can argue, you can distance yourself from each other, get hurt, have all these bad feelings, maybe even eventually throw in the towel. Or you can be in a why-centered marriage and understand that God's wanting to do something through it all. And when your sin is exposed, you do something about it. When your spouse's sin is exposed, you do something about it. You serve together on mission, and through that process, this sanctifying work in our lives, we end up becoming more like Jesus. Our spouse comes more like Jesus, and others around us end up becoming more like Jesus. It is all about the why. Success in marriage is not primarily about who you marry. It's about why you marry. And if you're single in the room, I want to just, whether you've been married or not, I want to leave you with these words. I'm going to pray them for you here in a second. Is that you would understand right now that you are already complete. You are already complete. God has done a great work through Jesus Christ to love you and to redeem you. You are already complete. You don't need another person to do that. And that you would begin to experience that love, and you would walk further into truth with Jesus Christ, into that relationship because of all that. And if you choose to date and get married, which is a great thing, it is an unbelievable blessing. I'm convinced if you want to serve God best, stay single. If you want to get more like God, more like Jesus, get married, because it's going to get exposed very quickly. It's a great relationship. It's a great blessing. That's awesome. But do it for the right reasons. Understand the why, that it's a relationship God's wanting to transform you through. And then you end up letting that impact the who. Don't date and get married to someone who just gives you butterflies, who you're just infatuated with, but rather someone who is a fellow sojourner trekking on a journey towards Jesus Christ. That's how we have success. Let's pray. God, we are so thankful for your grace. And I'm so thankful that we get to come here and talk about what you've done for us through Jesus Christ. Yet amazingly, and I'm not sure why we do it in the church, we are so gracious in our life, and then we get into a marriage and we show none, and we expect that someone else is going to be our Savior except for you. And I pray, God, that we would be a church that would understand that the opposite is true, God, that you are the only person that can complete us. You are the only person that can fulfill us. That it's only through what you've done for us in Jesus Christ that we have an identity, that we have a hope and a future. And that we wouldn't view marriage as something to complete us, but rather as something that you're wanting to do a work in us, God. And God, that we would have more marriages here that would be a reflection of the gospel, would be a reflection of the grace that you've shown us, and would be a loud testimony to the world of what you've done deep inside every one of us. I pray this in your name. Amen.
What a fellowship, what a joy divine, leaning on the everlasting arms. What a blessed peace, what a peace of mind, leaning on the everlasting arms. Leaning, safe and secure from all alarms. What have I to dread? What have I to fear? Leaning on the everlasting arms. I have blessed peace with my Lord so near. Leaning on the everlasting arms.